I'm gonna marry your sister. The ATM is no longer needed. I could hear the sneering laughter over the phone. But I didn't let out a sound of surprise. I thought if I played into their hands, I would be in a weaker position. And by now, I had not an ounce of love left for John. Sure, you better be ready. While I casually replied, inside, I was burning with rage. John, who dumped all the childcare, elderly care, and household chores on me, while he enjoyed an affair with Eleanor. Eleanor, too, after borrowing money from me, had the nerve to call me an ATM in the end. Unforgivable. You're okay with us getting a divorce? John pressed, and I simply nodded in agreement. Over the phone, the two of them raised voices of joy. They can laugh now, but not for long. There's no way they won't face divine punishment for demeaning me like this. I bit my lip hard. My name is Emma Smith. I'm 60 years old, living with my husband John, 5 years my senior. Our son, Mike, is 30 this year and has long since become independent and left home. Until recently, I worked part-time at a supermarket, but due to the recent spike in prices, I was forced into early retirement under the pretext of cutting labor costs. Having worked there for many years, the manager was very kind to me, and even though I was part-time, I received a severance package. It's a bit disappointing to retire before the usual age, but my time at the supermarket certainly helped me grow. I'm very grateful to the manager who kept me employed. You might think I'm set for a slow life in my retirement, but actually, I'm facing some issues at home. Well, more with my husband than home. I'm really anxious about whether our frosty marriage can last many more years. How did it come to this? Let me explain from the beginning. I met my husband John about 40 years ago. Back then, I was an active student, going around talking to various industry professionals. The seniors I talked to were mainly from the newspaper club I belonged to. There were many drinking parties with the club members, and alumni like John would often join. Emma, what kind of company do you want to work for? John, who was rumored to be the handsome senior in the club, asked me this with a comfortable distance. I honestly told John that I wanted to work for a stable company. How about my bank? Isn't being a banker the most stable? Indeed, it sounds like a solid job. Even though I responded in a generic way, I was delighted that John encouraged me to apply to his bank. I followed his suggestion and successfully got a job offer from John's bank. It wasn't too hard to get hired since my college had a good number of students employed there. Once I started working at the bank, I saw how popular John was. He always seemed to have someone inviting him out for drinks after work, and it seemed like I had no chance to get close. However, John was different. He often asked me out, and even though I felt guilty toward his other fans, I was interested in him, so we started going out for meals more often. This led to us dating, and 3 years later, we got married, and I quit the bank job. I did have some regrets about leaving my job after only 4 years, but at that time, most women resigned after getting married. Especially since John and I worked at the same place, he seemed to prefer that I take up part-time work elsewhere. Quitting my job was a given, but I never regretted marrying John. We enjoyed our life together until I was 30 when I got pregnant with our first son, Mike, and had him. John, who had treated me like a princess, suddenly became cold and distant after the baby was born. Can you make Mike's milk? Milk? That's a mother's job. Why do I have to do it? His attitude had done a 180 since before the birth, and I was more shocked than hurt or angry. I had heard that some men lose interest when their wife has a child. But I thought it was a rare case among many couples. Never did I imagine that John, who loved me so much, would suddenly turn cold after I had our child. After that, every day was a struggle. John flat out refused to help with any childcare. Childcare is the mother's job. Plus, you're a stay-at-home mom, you should be taking care of him. I'm busy with work. Though John had his reasons, they didn't sit right with me. But it's hard for me too, being a first-time mom. When I tried to argue, John glared sharply at me. If it's that hard, why don't you go stay with my dad? He's retired, he could help out. With your father? Yeah, that's right. I was stunned by John's suggestion. His mother had passed away early, and now his father, living alone, had recently injured his leg and might soon need care. It seemed absurd to have his father, who might need care himself, take care of our child. Not to mention, John was not involved in childcare at all, effectively just pushing the responsibility onto his parents. I was overwhelmed by John's outlandish idea, Since then, John hardly helped with childcare, and I raised Mike alone, often consulting childcare books. Fortunately, Mike was a well-behaved and obedient child who listened to me and grew up straight and strong. When Mike was 5, I noticed a missed call on my cell phone after dropping him off at kindergarten. "Hello, Emma? Dad collapsed. I'm thinking of putting him in a facility, so could you handle the paperwork?" "What? Collapsed? Is he okay? And a facility?" I was startled by John's call, my heart racing. It wasn't a small matter to hear that my father-in-law had collapsed. I wondered if he had been taken to the hospital properly. Given his bad leg, it must have been quite a challenge. My father-in-law, who treated me like his own daughter, loved seeing Mike, whom I took to visit him regularly, even without John's urging. It was a 40-minute drive from our home to my in-laws. Every time we visited, my father-in-law would warmly thank us for coming from so far. Both Mike and I adored him, and no matter the distance, we were always willing to visit. I was filled with anxiety when I heard he had collapsed, but John only spoke about putting him in a facility in a very businesslike manner, which irked me. It's okay. I'm heading out for field work now. Take care of it, please." "Wait a minute." John quickly ended the call after saying his piece. The idea of putting my father-in-law in a facility was unfathomable to me. Unless it was his own wish, John seemed to have decided on his own to put him in a facility. After much deliberation, I decided to take care of my father-in-law once he got better. When I went to the hospital where my father-in-law was, he had already regained consciousness in his room. He was 70 years old and had been struggling to continue the family farming business. Both John and I had been urging him to rest because of his bad leg, but it seemed he still went out to the fields that morning. "Emma, I'm sorry for causing you trouble." "No, it's okay. Just please don't overdo it." "Oh." True to form, my father-in-law seemed to have learned from this incident. After his discharge, he stopped going out to the fields. His farm was no longer a place for growing crops, just empty land left behind. While it could be used again with some care, this land would likely be passed down to John, his only son, and I couldn't imagine John taking up farming. I felt sorry for the abandoned farm, but if it meant my father-in-law wouldn't harm his health further, then it was for the best. From then on, I visited my father-in-law 3 times a week to take care of him. Around that time, I also started a part-time job at a supermarket. I had to juggle the part-time job, childcare, elderly care, and housework. Regarding childcare, I switched Mike from kindergarten to daycare, taking advantage of extended care to make time. I worked the part-time job 4 times a week, from the morning until just afternoon, and then went to my in-laws' house on days I finished work. After taking care of my father-in-law, I would pick up Mike from daycare before heading home to cook dinner. At first, it was a very difficult and unfamiliar task. As I got used to it, it became somewhat easier, but I didn't realize how tired I was becoming. I was so busy with work and home life that I didn't have time to talk to John. This went on for about 10 years, and by that time, I was 45 and John was 50. By then, Mike had grown into a mature middle schooler, often showing signs of rebellion towards me. However, I saw this as a sign of him becoming independent, and though I felt lonely, I was happy to see him grow. But Mike never showed any rebellion towards John. In fact, they hardly spoke at all. Since John had abandoned parenting duties from the time Mike was born, leaving everything to me, it seemed like Mike didn't even think of John as his father. Our marriage and family relationship had become cold and distant, and it reached a crisis around this time. The trouble began with a call from my sister, Eleanor. "Hello, Emma? I just got back from a trip to Hawaii with friends and have some souvenirs. Can I come over to your place?" Eleanor, 3 years my senior, has always been reckless with money and has a volatile temper, making it difficult for us to get along. She always wore flashy makeup and was more beautiful than me. I wondered what was going on when she said she wanted to give me a souvenir but didn't want to dismiss her goodwill and agreed to let her come over. When Eleanor arrived that weekend, she handed me souvenirs, but they were obviously local snacks, not from Hawaii. I chose not to point this out, as it would surely upset her. "Hey Emma, I'm in a bit of a pinch this month. Can you lend me some money?" Suddenly, after giving me false souvenirs, she was asking for money. "Why do you need to borrow money?" I suspected it was just her usual overspending. "Well, I've been feeling sick lately. I might need to be hospitalized, but I don't have insurance and can't afford the hospital or treatment costs. Eleanor said this, looking downcast, and I couldn't find words to respond. What kind of illness required hospitalization? I stared at her silently for a while, but she looked at me with pleading eyes. Okay. Just make sure you pay me back after you're treated. Thank you. Sisters are really the best. Eleanor's face lit up, and she shook my hand vigorously. Despite our differences, she was my sister, and I wanted her to get better if she was sick. By the way, when is John coming back? Knowing I would lend her the money, Eleanor casually asked this as if it was an afterthought. He's just at Walmart right now. Oh, I see. Well, I'll just say hello and then leave. Right at that moment, John came back home. Hello, John. Oh, Eleanor. You're here. Yes, just had something to talk to Emma about. I'm done now, so I'll be leaving. Eleanor stood up, and as she passed by John, it looked like she whispered something in his ear. After she left, I asked John, "What did Eleanor say to you?" But he dismissed it, saying, "Oh, nothing important." I was curious, but soon forgot about it. The affair between John and Eleanor was discovered a month later. I was supposed to visit my father-in-law that day, but got held up at work, so I postponed the visit and returned home as usual. Mike was at his tutoring class, and John was supposed to be the only one at home. Why are there women's shoes here? As I took off my shoes at the entrance, I noticed a familiar pair of heels. The same ones Eleanor had worn over the weekend. I swallowed hard and entered the house. The living room was empty, briefly relieving me. But then I heard unmistakable sounds from John and Eleanor in the bedroom. What are they doing? I thought about confronting them right there, but hesitated. What if John asked for a divorce? Mike wouldn't want to go with John. But I wasn't sure I could afford his education on my own. If I was going to divorce, I wanted to wait until Mike graduated from college. Frustrated, I left the house, deciding to pretend I hadn't seen anything. Instead, I gathered evidence of the affair, taking photos and secretly saving messages from John's phone. It seemed they had been having an affair for about 6 months. I was boiling with anger, but kept telling myself it was for Mike's sake, enduring the days without exposing the affair. 15 years had passed, and Mike had become a respectable adult. He quit his job at the company he joined after graduation and started his own business. Now, he is working hard every day as the president of his company. After retiring from the supermarket, I worked a bit at Mike's company. I had been giving Eleanor money for her treatments, but as her demands became too persistent, I grew tired of lending her money and started ignoring her calls. John and Eleanor's affair seemed to have ended about a year after it came to light. Perhaps John grew tired of her and chose to stay with me. Realizing this, I lost the will to confront them about the affair and chose to turn a blind eye. However, I realized my naivety when I heard of my father-in-law's passing. I learned about my father-in-law's passing through a call from John during the day. He passed away peacefully at the age of 95, but I was deeply shocked. Unlike John, my father-in-law was kind and considerate, and I mourned him as if I had lost my own parent. Yet even in such a moment, John said with a laugh, "Dad seems to have saved up quite a fortune, can't wait to see it." I was so angry that I was about to give John a piece of my mind, when suddenly I heard a woman's laughter nearby. Oops, did we just get caught being together? It was Eleanor's voice that sent chills down my spine. Was their relationship not over? For the past 15 years, they had been sneaking around behind my back. Realizing this, they seemed like unknown entities to me. "I'm gonna marry your sister." The ATM is no longer needed. I could hear their sneering laughter over the phone. But I didn't let out a sound of surprise. If I played into their hands, I knew I'd be putting myself in a weaker position. Besides, I was beyond being shocked by then. I didn't have a speck of love left for John. "Sure, you better be ready." While I casually replied, inside, I was burning with rage. John had dumped all the childcare, elderly care, and household chores on me, while he enjoyed an affair with Eleanor. And Eleanor, after borrowing money from me, had the nerve to call me an ATM in the end. Unforgivable. "You're okay with us getting a divorce?" John pressed, and I simply nodded in agreement. Over the phone, the two of them raised voices of joy. They can laugh now, but not for long. There's no way they won't face divine punishment for demeaning me like this. I bit my lip hard. After my father-in-law's funeral, I submitted the divorce papers as promised. When I informed John, he pretended to be happy. Now that we're divorced, move out of this house as soon as possible. Me moving out? I asked in surprise, to which John nodded as if it was obvious. I'll be living with Eleanor now. You can live alone. This house is too big for one person. His reasoning left me more dumbfounded than angry. Fine, I said, not even in the mood to argue, and agreed to his terms. Though I was furious, I had already thought about my living situation before the divorce. I left our house and headed to Mike's place, who was living independently. I had informed Mike beforehand, and he welcomed his mother, who had just split up with John. He was such a kind son. I resolved to work harder than ever at Mike's company. A few days later, I received a call from a man claiming to be a lawyer. When I went to the designated place, John, Eleanor, and the lawyer were seated. From Mr. John's father, I have a will to present, said the lawyer, pulling out the will from his bag. I was surprised, not knowing my father-in-law had left a will. Since John was an only child, he was the sole legal heir to his father's estate. No longer John's wife, I had no claim to any inheritance. Yet, why was I called here? As I was pondering this, the lawyer began reading the will. The contents of the will were astonishing. My father-in-law had left half of his assets to me. This meant that the farmland he owned now belonged to me. Although John, being the only child, was entitled to half of the inheritance as well, he had obviously expected to inherit everything, so this was a complete shock to him. Why is Emma getting half of the inheritance? I'm the only son, I should get it all. The late Mr. Smith greatly appreciated Emma's devoted care, even though she wasn't related by blood. He wanted to thank her. I was deeply moved by his kindness. What is this? I thought we'd have an easy life with the inheritance. Eleanor fumed in frustration. The lawyer went on to explain that my father-in-law had also written in the will that any debts would be solely inherited by John. However, John and Eleanor seemed too shaken to fully grasp this part of the will. Tears streamed down my face as I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Seeing me cry, John and Eleanor's anger only seemed to increase. The lawyer concluded with a firm tone, that concludes the contents of the will. Well, I'm not happy about losing half, but at least we still have half of the inheritance. Gotta thank the law for that, John said, patting Eleanor's shoulder. Eleanor, seeming a bit consoled, nodded in agreement. We're done here. We won't have anything to do with you anymore, so take care, they said, laughing loudly as they left. I returned to Mike's house, cherishing the last act of kindness from my father-in-law. Having received the inheritance, I worked at Mike's company without any issues, and 2 months flew by quickly. Then, one Sunday, John called me. Mike and I were enjoying a day off at home when my phone started ringing loudly. John. I froze, realizing it was him. Why is he calling? You already left him, Mom. You don't need to answer, Mike said. Despite trying to ignore it, the persistent ringing continued. Annoyed, I finally answered to silence John. Why are you calling me repeatedly? Didn't you say you'd never involve yourself with me again? I asked disdainfully. John, seemingly oblivious to my words, blurted out his concerns in a near frenzy. Hey, what's going on? Why are you working at Mike's company? And why is his company on TV? They even showed his house, and it's so luxurious. John's voice, seemingly in a frenzy, came through the phone loud enough for Mike, sitting next to me, to frown in disapproval. You saw the TV show. I realized why John was calling. Recently, a TV station had featured Mike's sports gym, which he had started. It was a new concept combining a gym and a cafe, attracting the station's interest. Since opening the gym, the number of members kept skyrocketing, and Mike, as a young and successful entrepreneur, appeared on the show, just as John mentioned. They even showcased his house. The house I currently live in with Mike is what you'd call a mansion, spacious and distinctively more grandiose than the surrounding homes. John must have seen the show and been astonished by the lifestyle Mike and I were living. What do you mean you guys are living in such a big house? Look, Eleanor spent all of Dad's inheritance, and I'm left with his debts. Damn it, I didn't hear about any debts when the lawyer talked to us. John was yelling on the phone, frustrated. The lawyer had indeed informed us about the debts at the time. But John didn't pay attention. It wasn't my fault, and I wasn't the one to be blamed. Well, that's not my problem, is it? It's your responsibility for not paying attention to the lawyer. And you knew Eleanor had a spending habit even before you married her, didn't you? I lent her money for her treatment and she hasn't paid me back. It's clear now. Both you and Eleanor are untrustworthy, betraying people who trusted you. John was speechless at my logic. And, after all, aren't you the one who cheated? Why should I be the one blamed here? I don't understand at all. After venting my frustrations, I felt somewhat relieved. Realizing he couldn't blame me, John suddenly changed his tone to a pleading one. Emma, please, I'm begging you. Just lend me some money. I was supposed to retire this year and receive my pension, but I got fired, and all I'm left with are Dad's debts. Eleanor left me after a fight about money. What am I supposed to do now? You're my only hope. I was wrong about everything. Please, spare some of Dad's inheritance for me. You're living a good life with Mike, aren't you? Think of it as helping someone in need, okay? The audacity of John begging his ex-wife, whom he cheated on, for money was astonishing. Mike, who had been listening to our conversation, looked like he had something to say. I handed him the phone. Mike turned on the speaker and firmly addressed John. Dad, you betrayed Mom and married Aunt Eleanor. And ever since I was born, you never took care of me. I don't have any memories of playing with you. It was always just me and Mom. She was the one who came to all my school events. That's why I'm helping her now, living and working together. Why should I lend money to a father who never did anything for me? My only parent is Mom. I won't give you a single cent. Mike spoke like a true businessman, decisive and strong. I felt overwhelmed with pride. On the other end, John gasped. Mike, how can you say that to your father? Fine, I won't rely on you two ever again. Don't underestimate me. He hung up abruptly. We looked at each other, almost laughing at the absurdity. He comes begging for money and then says he won't involve himself with us? Ridiculous. Right. Dad has always been impulsive. As we were discussing John's foolishness, the phone rang again. It was John. Despite saying he wouldn't get involved, he probably wanted to ask for money again. In disbelief, I blocked John's contact. This means that foolish guy can't bother us anymore. Yeah. Thanks, Mom. His thanks seemed to carry not just gratitude for today's events, but also for how I had almost single-handedly raised him. I'm the one who's thankful for being able to have such a good life. No matter how old you get, you're always my precious son. We continued to affirm our familial bond, feeling grateful for each other's presence in our spacious home. A few days later, I got a call from my sister, Eleanor. The content was almost the same as what John had said earlier. I couldn't fathom lending more money to Eleanor, who hadn't even repaid what she already owed. In fact, since she hadn't yet paid alimony for having an affair with John, I took this opportunity to successfully demand alimony from both of them through a lawyer. Now even more in debt, the phrase money is the tie that binds seemed fitting as they ended up divorcing. It was essentially a marriage that lasted only 2 months. John's situation was even more disastrous than Eleanor's. After all, the negative inheritance he received from his father was too great. My father-in-law had borrowed a lot of money to continue farming alone. It was something I didn't know. During the time I was taking care of him, he constantly complained about John. It was tolerable that John didn't continue farming, but his negligence towards Mike and not even visiting his parents' home was unacceptable. He was also furious about John's attitude towards me, and I always had to calm him down, saying it's okay. Given how upset my kind father-in-law was, John must have been a terribly irresponsible son when they lived together. John, buried in negative inheritance, lost his severance pay due to being dismissed for misconduct. I heard through the grapevine that John, in an attempt to pay off his debts, tried to embezzle money from the bank he worked at. If he had just worked quietly until the end, he would have received his retirement money, but John, blinded by the money in front of him, was truly foolish. Now, he's receiving a pension and juggling about 3 part-time jobs to pay off his debts. Starting a new job at 65 and being taught by younger people must be a blow to his pride. Having worked as a banker for many years, a rookie part-time job involves a lot of menial tasks. I doubt John, who never took care of housework, childcare, or caregiving, can endure such work. He'll probably give up soon. I think it's a fitting punishment for John, who neglected his son's upbringing and had an affair with Eleanor for so long. I hope he keeps at it until the end. As for me, I'm still happily working at Mike's workplace. The staff, who are about my age, are very kind to me. It's a workplace that's always filled with smiles, which I believe is why we have so many customers. Mike recently got engaged to a girl a year younger than him at work and introduced her to me. She's a very sensible and lovely young lady. Well respected by everyone at work. I was planning to move out of the house when they married, but she suggested we live together. I'm grateful for her kind gesture and looking forward to our life together as a family of 3.